Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is one of the biggest events I've done in a long time, so it's exciting to be in this room with everyone. My name is Elizabeth Rush. I teach at the nonfiction writing program here at Brown University, and it's my honor to welcome you to the second event in the 2022 Nonfiction at Brown reading series, Maggie Nelson. We would not have been able to host tonight's event without a host of different people contributing and helping out. So I want to take a moment here to thank, and it's a long list, the Koget Institute, the Institute at Brown for the Environment and Society, the Marshall Woods Lectureship Foundation, the Swearer Center, the Zucker Family Endowment, the Shane Family Fund, and the Initiative for the Environmental Humanities. Special thanks also to Ellen Viola and Aaron Fine, who worked so hard to make this event happen. Looking ahead, I just want to note that we'll have our third and final speaker, Liza Yeager, who's a Brown grad. She'll be coming on December 7th. She's gone on to produce and report excellent radio pieces for Invisibilia, Planet Money, 99% Invisible, The Dig, and others, and she'll be speaking about listening as action at 6 p.m. in Pembroke, again, on December 7th. Tonight, Maggie Nelson will read from her most recent book, On Freedom, and then we'll follow that reading with an onstage conversation between myself and Michael Stewart, who's also the co-organizer of this event and a person without whom none of this would be possible. I'd also like to say that Maggie Nelson will be signing books in the lobby, and those books are being sold by 20 Stories, one of our fabulous indie bookstores here in Providence. So please take time to come get a book and get a book signed. So now I'd like to welcome Tim Buse, the chair of the English department, to the stage. He's here to introduce Maggie Nelson. Thank you.
I want to begin by thanking my colleagues from the Department of English, Elizabeth Rush and Michael Stewart, for all their efforts and what feels to me like magic to make this event happen. Maggie Nelson's work is centrally present in 3 undergraduate literature courses I have taught in recent years, and I have a personal history of failed attempts to bring Maggie to Brown. So it is a genuine thrill finally to meet her and to have the opportunity to host and welcome her here. As everybody here knows, Maggie Nelson is one of the most important, innovative, and epoch-defining writers of our time. I'll say more about her work in a moment. But Nelson is also a person with a job, i.e. an institutional affiliation. She's currently professor of English at the University of Southern California, as well as theorist in residence at the California Institute of the Arts, where she previously taught for more than a decade. That period at Cal Arts was a formative one for Nelson's writing, during which she wrote and published an extraordinary series of works, including The Red Parts, Autobiography of a Trial, published by Free Press in 2007, and then republished by Grey Wolf in 2016. The scholarly work, Women, the New York School, and Other True Abstractions, from 2007. Bluets, published by Wave in 2009. The Art of Cruelty, A Reckoning, published by Norton in 2011. And perhaps her best-known work, The Argonauts, published by Grey Wolf in 2015. Prior to The Red Parts, she published 3 volumes of poetry, including Jane, a Murder, from 2005, which was followed by Something Bright, Then Holes, both of those published by Soft Skull, and the latter in 2007. Nelson is the recipient of many prestigious fellowships and awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010, a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship in 2011, the 2016 National Book Critics Circle Award in 2016, awarded for The Argonauts, and a MacArthur Fellowship awarded the same year. And in 2019, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Elizabeth has already described the context of tonight's event, the English department's Nonfiction at Brown series, co-organized by herself and Michael Stewart. But in many ways, It is ironic that Maggie Nelson should be a guest in a series devoted to nonfiction writing. From the beginning, Nelson's project has been devoted to putting into question the governing assumptions of any genre category that she could possibly be confined within, not least, indeed primarily, those of nonfiction and memoir. Among the most distinctive themes of her work is its disavowal of any easy equation between the content of her work and the lessons or knowledge that might be derived from it. I want to read one of my favorite passages of Nelson's writing from The Red Parts, the companion book to Jane, A Murder, in which she revisits the case of the murder of her aunt Jane after a suspect is arrested, tried, and convicted for the killing in 2005, more than 35 years after the crime. Nelson remembers receiving a postcard from her mother years earlier with a quotation from the writer Joan Didion, quote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live," unquote. Reflecting on her own turn to poetry, Nelson pushes back on what she initially considers Didion's sentimental understanding of literature. "I became a poet in part because I didn't want to tell stories," Nelson says. "Stories may enable us to live, but they also trap us, bring us spectacular pain. In their scramble to make sense of nonsensical things, they distort, codify, blame, aggrandize, restrict, omit, betray, mythologize, you name it." I'm actually going to come back to that series of words in a moment. But continuing the quotation, "This has always struck me as a cause for lament, not celebration. As soon as a writer starts talking about the human need for narrative or the archaic power of storytelling, I usually find myself wanting to bolt out of the auditorium. Otherwise, my blood creeps up to my face and begins to boil." In my humble opinion, as we say nowadays, this is one of the great programmatic statements of 21st century literature. A page later, Nelson elaborates, "If I can make my language flat enough, exact enough, if I can rinse each sentence clean enough, like washing a stone over and over again in river water, if I can find the right perch or crevice from which to record everything, if I can give myself enough white space, maybe I could do it. I could tell this story while walking out of the story." So much of Nelson's writing, certainly since Jane, A Murder, reads like a way to tell the story while walking out of the story. I take this to mean telling the story without it cohering around the narrating self, an orientation that would falsify the work by having it reaffirm the great uber-falsehood of our age, the ego. This principle of her work renders the term memoir insufficient even for Nelson's most autobiographical writing. However, we should add a further codicil, also taken from Nelson's work, one that accounts for the shift towards narrative in works such as The Red Parts and the Argonauts. If I insist that there is a persona or a performativity at work, we read in the Argonauts, I don't mean to say that I'm not myself in my writing, or that my writing somehow isn't me. I'm with Eileen Miles, quote, "My dirty secret has always been that it's of course about me," unquote. Perhaps, if she will permit it, we could invert the important observation in this passage to reveal its underside. If I insist that my work is nonfiction, that doesn't mean that what I'm writing are facts, or that the self who is speaking in the work is the same self who writes the work. The dirty secret of nonfiction writing in the hands of a writer like Nelson is that, of course, it's also fiction, which is not to say it isn't true. This is also the implication of the extraordinary conceit of Nelson's 2015 book, The Argonauts, the image taken from Roland Barthes of a ship that is entirely rebuilt over many years, plank by plank, while still bearing the name Argo. What Nelson's narrator says there about affirmations of love applies precisely to literature. Quote, "Words change depending on who speaks them. There is no cure," unquote. To practice language or writing or criticism or love under any other conditions is incessantly to distort, codify, blame, aggrandize, restrict, omit, betray, or mythologize one's object. Maggie Nelson's latest work is On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, from which she will now read, and a conversation will follow. Let's welcome her most warmly to Brown.
Thank you, guys. I love that introduction. I don't know, usually it's like that moment where you're like, oh my God, introduction, and you're like looking at your feet or something, but I was like riveted. So anyway, I really liked that reading of the work, and I really liked the attention to story, and I just started reading that. Did you see that Peter Brook's new book? I can't remember what it's called, but it's all against story, and anyway, but it's very, I'm not going to bolt out of the auditorium if anyone wants to talk about the archaic power of storytelling. As just mentioned, that is also a grumpy persona speaking that passage. I don't remember the failed attempts to bring me to Brown. I don't know what they are, but I'm really glad. I don't know, maybe I've repressed them, but I'm really glad to be here now. Elizabeth, Michael, thank you for having me. Thank you for all the students who I met earlier today. You guys are so awesome and asked such great questions. So, one of the weird parts about writing a lot of different kinds of books is that sometimes people are like, oh, I like the other kind of book. So I say that in order to tell you in preparation that this book on freedom is, I'm just going to read the first 7 pages of it, and then we can have a conversation. But this book is, I don't even know what I want to call it as per the introduction. I guess I would say it's in a more scholarly or philosophical idiom than certainly, more obviously autobiographical or lyrical one. So if that's not your jam, you'll just have to bear with me. And so I'll just read the beginning of this book. And the beginning of this book, this is a really hard book, it turns out, to go around and read about, because it has 4 chapters, one about the art world, one about sexual freedom and sexual liberation, one about drugs and addiction literature, and then one about climate crisis and kind of the affective space of dealing with global warming. It's like often I have to pick, like, are we going to have a night where we talk about sexual liberation and narratives of its failure or success? Or are we going to have a night where we talk about climate? It's a hard book to read from. So for that reason, I'll read from the introduction, but the introduction is a little bit more, broadly stated than the case studies of the book that follow. Okay, so here we go. So stop here if you want to talk about freedom. I had wanted to write a book about freedom. I had wanted to write this book at least since the subject emerged as an unexpected subtext in a book of mine about art and cruelty. I had set out to write about cruelty, and then I found, to my surprise, freedom coming up through the cracks, light and air into cruelty's stuffy cell. Once exhausted by cruelty, I turned to freedom directly. I started with What is Freedom by Hannah Arendt and began to amass my piles. But before long, I diverted and wrote a book about care. Some people thought the book about care was also a book about freedom. This was satisfying, as I too felt this to be the case. For some time, I thought a book on freedom might no longer be necessary, maybe not by me, maybe not by anyone. Can you think of a more depleted, imprecise, or weaponized word? I used to care about freedom, but now I mostly care about love, one friend told me. Freedom feels like a corrupt and emptied word for war, a commercial export, something a patriarch gives or rescinds, another friend wrote. That is a white word, said another. Often I agreed with them. Why not take up with some less contested, obviously timely or worthy value, such as obligation, mutual aid, coexistence, resiliency, sustainability, or what Manolo Callahan has called insubordinate conviviality? Why not acknowledge that freedom's long star turn might finally be coming to a close, and that a continued obsession with it may reflect a death drive? Your freedom is killing me, read the signs of protesters during a pandemic. Your health is not more important than my liberty, others shout back. And yet, I still could not quit it. Part of the trouble resides in the word itself, whose meaning is not at all self-evident or shared. In fact, it operates more like God, in that when we use the word, we can never really be sure what exactly we're talking about, or whether we're talking about the same thing. Are we talking about negative freedom, positive freedom, anarchist freedom, Marxist freedom, abolitionist freedom, libertarian freedom, white settler freedom, decolonizing freedom, neoliberal freedom, Zapatista freedom, spiritual freedom, and so on? All of which leads to Wittgenstein's famous edict that the meaning of a word is its use. I thought of this formulation the other day when on my university campus I passed by a banner that read, "Stop here if you want to talk about freedom." Boy, do I thought. So I stopped and asked the young white man, probably an undergraduate, what type of freedom he wanted to talk about. He looked me up and down, then said slowly, with a hint of menace and a hint of insecurity, "You know, regular old freedom." I noticed that he was selling buttons divided into saving the unborn, owning the libs, and gun rights. As Wittgenstein's work makes clear, that the meaning of a word is its use is not a cause for paralysis or lament. It can instead act as an incitement to track which language game is being played. Such is the approach taken in the pages that follow, in which freedom acts as a reusable train ticket, marked or perforated by the many stations, hands, and vessels through which it passes. I borrow this metaphor of the train ticket from Wayne Custenbaum, who once used it to describe the way a word or a set of words permutates in the work of Gertrude Stein. Custenbaum writes, "What the word means is none of your business, but it is indubitably your business where the word travels." For whatever the confusions wrought from talking about freedom, they do not in essence differ from the misunderstandings we risk when we talk to one another about other things. And talk to one another we must, even or especially if we are, as poet George Oppen had it, no longer sure of the words. This little section is called A Crisis of Freedom. Looking back, my decision to stick with the term appears to have two roots. The first involves my long-standing frustration with its capture by the right wing, as in evidence at the young man's card table. This capture has been underway for centuries, as freedom for us, subjugation for you, has been at work since the nation's founding. But after the 60s, a time during which, as historian Robin Kelly recalls in his book Freedom Dreams, this is a quote from Kelly about the 60s, freedom was the goal our people were trying to achieve. Free was a verb. Free was an act. It was a wish. It was a militant demand, as in free the land, free your mind, free South Africa, free Angola, free Angela Davis, free Huey. Those are the slogans I remember best, end quote. So after this time, the right wing doubled down on its claim. In just a few brutal neoliberal decades, the rallying cry of freedom is epitomized in the Freedom Summer, Freedom Schools, Freedom Riders, women's liberation, gay liberation, was overtaken by the likes of the American Freedom Party, Capitalism and Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, the Religious Freedom Act, Alliance Defending Freedom, and so much more. This shift has led some political philosophers, such as Judith Butler, to refer to our times as post-liberatory, though, as Fred Moten notes, pre-liberatory might be just as accurate. Either way, the debate as to where we stand temporally in relation to freedom could be read as a symptom of what Wendy Brown has called a developing crisis of freedom, in which, quote, the particular anti-democratic powers of our time, which can flourish even in so-called democracies, have produced subjects, including those working under the banner of progressive politics, who appear, in Brown's words, disoriented as to freedom's value, and have allowed the language of resistance to take up the ground vacated by a more expansive practice of freedom, end quote. In the face of such a crisis, sticking with the term seemed to me one way to refuse this trade and to test the word's remaining or evacuated possibilities. It was a way to hold ground. The second root of this project, which complicates the first, And I guess now we're back to what we just heard about. I'm like a broken record. Okay, at least I'm talking about something else. Freedom. Okay, the second root, which complicates the first, is that I've long had reservations about the emancipatory rhetoric of past eras, especially the kind that treats liberation as a one-time event or an event horizon. Nostalgia for prior notions of liberation, many of which depend heavily upon mythologies of revelation, violent upheaval, revolutionary machismo, and teleological progress, often strikes me as not useful or worse in the face of certain present challenges, such as global warming. Freedom dreams that consistently figure freedom's arrival as a day of reckoning, as in Martin Luther King Jr.'s day when all of God's children will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, great God Almighty, we are free at last. These can be crucial, utterly crucial, to helping us imagine futures that we want. But they can also condition us into thinking of freedom as a future achievement rather than an unending present practice, something already going on. So if ceding freedom to noxious forces is a grievous error, so too is holding on to rote, unventilated concepts of it with a white-knuckled grip. For this reason, Michel Foucault's distinction between liberation, conceived of as a momentary act, and practices of freedom, conceived of as ongoing, has been key for me, as when Foucault writes, liberation paves the way for new power relationships, which must be controlled by practices of freedom, end quote. I like this proposition very much. I would even say it is a guiding principle of this book. No doubt it will strike some as a giant buzzkill. Power relationships, control, isn't the whole point to ditch all that? Maybe, but be careful what you wish for. This is Wendy Brown's point when she says that the freedom to self-govern requires, in her words, inventive and careful use of power rather than a rebellion against authority. It is sober, it is exhausting, and it is without parents, end quote. I think Brown is probably right, even if sober, exhausting, and without parents is a tough rallying cry, especially for those who already, I know I kept thinking like, should we go around and be like, self-governance, it's sober, it's exhausting, it's without parents, and like, see what kind of buy-in we get. But I think, I'm kidding, but it's actually, a question, I think, at the heart of this whole project. Okay, it's a tough rallying cry, especially for those who already feel exhausted and uncared for. But I find this approach more inspiring and workable than waiting for the final big night of liberation, as French economist Frédéric Lordon has put it, the apocalyptic showdown, followed by the sudden and miraculous eruption of a totally different kind of human and social relations, end quote. Lordon's argument is that letting go of our hopes for this big night may be the best means of saving the idea of liberation. I tend to agree. Moments of liberation, such as those brought about by a revolutionary rupture or even personal peak experiences, matter enormously, as they remind us that conditions that once seemed fixed are not, and they create opportunities to alter course, to decrease domination, and to start anew. But the practice of freedom, the morning after, and then the morning after that, is what, if we are lucky, takes up most of our waking lives. This book is about that experiment unending. All right, I'm going to read one last section, which is just 2.5 pages. So this section's called The Knot. No matter what cause you advocate, you must sell it in the language of freedom. I didn't say that. The person who said that was Representative Dick Armey from Texas, founder of Freedom Works. Whatever my feelings about Dick Armey, I began this project presuming that his dictum was, in the United States, fated to remain pretty solid, which is, again, no matter what cause you advocate, you must sell it in the language of freedom. By the time I sat down to write this book, however, it was the fall of 2016, and Armey's dictum seemed to be swiftly unraveling. After years of freedom fries, freedom's never free, the Freedom Caucus, the rhetoric of freedom appeared momentarily in retreat, with proto-authoritarianism rushing into its place. In the run-up to the 2016 election, I spent more hours than I care to admit watching Trump's online supporters come up with new terms of despot endearment, such as the patriarch, king, daddy, godfather, all-father, or my personal favorite, God-emperor. And I'm not just talking about this is all very dated now, but this is the problem about writing in time, right? Okay, I mean, it's not dated, it's just more worse. Thank you, whoever said that. Okay, and I'm not just talking about the 8chan crowd. After the election, the Republican National Committee sent out a Christmas tweet heralding the good news of a new king, an indication of all that was to come. Multiple word clouds have since confirmed freedom is scarcely to be found. This is the dated part. I think this has shifted a little bit. I think it's because we can get into it later. But freedom is scarcely to be found in Trump speak, save in the cynical invocation of free speech deployed as a troll, or in Trump's ghastly iteration of freedom as impunity. When you're a star, you can do whatever you want. Even the administration's 2019 effort to brand natural gas, quote unquote, freedom gas, sounded more like deliberate scatological farce than earnest ideological branding. So over the next few years, the airport kiosks lit up with titles such as How Democracies Die, Fascism, a Warning, On Tyranny, Surviving Autocracy, The Road to Unfreedom. Wendy Brown's warning about an existential disappearance of freedom from the world felt newly corroborated, as did her worry that decades of privileging market freedoms over democratic ones may have led some to lose a longing for the freedom of self-governance, and to develop a taste for unfreedom, a desire for subjection even in its place. Such concerns many times brought to my mind James Baldwin's observation in The Fire Next Time, where he writes, "I have met only a very few people, and most of these were not Americans, who had any real desire to be free. Freedom is hard to bear," end quote. In such a climate, it was tempting to write a book that aimed to reorient us as to freedom's very value, as Brown had it, or to encourage myself and others to join the ranks of James Baldwin's very few people with a real desire to be free. Such entreaties typically begin with a strong argument about what freedom is or what it ought to be, as in Avery Gordon's The Hawthorne Archives, a fugitive space for what she describes as the political consciousness of runaway slaves, war deserters, prison abolitionists, commoners, and other radicals. In the Hawthorne Archives, Gordon asserts, in a paraphrase of Tony Cade Bambara, that freedom is not the end of history or an elusive goal never achievable. It is not a better nation state, however disguised as a cooperative. It is not an ideal set of rules detached from the people who make them or live by them. And it is certainly not the right to own the economic, social, political, or cultural capital in order to dominate others and trade their happiness in a market. Freedom is the process by which you develop a practice for being unavailable for servitude, end quote. I have been moved and edified by many such entreaties, including the one above, but they are not in the end my style. The pages that follow do not diagnose a crisis of freedom and propose a means of fixing it or of fixing us, nor do they take political freedom as their focus. Instead, they bear down on the felt complexities of the freedom drive in 4 distinct realms: art, sex, drugs, and climate, wherein the coexistence of freedom, care, and constraint seem to me particularly thorny and acute. In each realm, I pay attention to the ways in which freedom is knotted up with so-called unfreedom, producing marbled experiences of compulsion, discipline, possibility, and surrender. Because we tend, often correctly, to associate unfreedom with the presence of oppressive circumstances that we can and should work to change, it makes sense that we might instinctively treat the knot of freedom and unfreedom as a source of perfidy and pain. To expose how domination can disguise itself as liberation, we become compelled to pull the strands of the knot apart, aiming to extricate the emancipatory from the oppressive. This is especially so when we're dealing with the link between slavery and freedom in Western history and thought, the ways in which they develop together and give each other meaning, and also the ways in which white people have, for centuries, cannily deployed the discourse of freedom to delay, diminish, or deny it to others. This approach, this kind of extricating the emancipatory from the oppressive approach, also makes sense if and when one's goal is to expose the economic ideologies that align freedom with the willingness to become a slave of capital. But if we allow ourselves to wander away, if only for a spell, that's for the worried among you who don't want to, are worried if we wander away, it's only for a spell, from the exclusive task of exposing and condemning domination, we may find that there is more to be found in the knot of freedom and unfreedom than a blueprint for past and present regimes of brutality. For it is here, in this knot, that sovereignty and self-abandon, subjectivity and subjection, autonomy and dependency, recreation and need, obligation and refusal, the supranatural and the sublunary commingle, sometimes ecstatically, sometimes catastrophically. It is here that we become disabused of the fantasy that all selves yearn only, or even mostly, for coherence, legibility, self-governance, agency, power, or even survival. Such a destabilizing might sound hip, but it can also be disquieting, depressing, and destructive. That is all part of the freedom drive, too. If we take time to fathom it, we may find ourselves less trapped by freedom's myths and slogans, less stunned and dispirited by its paradoxes, and more alive to its challenges. All right, that is all I'm going to read, and then you have to read the rest to get into the challenges and the muck of the knot. So anyway, thank you for listening. And I now invite Elizabeth and Michael on stage for the conversation portion of this evening. Okay.
Thanks so much, Maggie. That was great.
Thank you.
I have the first question for the evening, and it kind of builds on some of the stuff that you just read from. I feel like, it's there in the opening gambit of this book that this is a book about freedom, but that's not going to be, you're not so interested in it as like something achieved after like the radical revolution has won in the future. You're interested in like a patient labor in the present tense and kind of sitting in that space and thinking about freedom in that space. And I'm curious, how did this book get started? You kind of talked about amassing piles, but I'm also wondering, like, does your life as a writer inform it? Is there a point where you're like, okay, I've got all these piles and I can't turn away from this anymore? So there's kind of two questions there. Like, is there an event that tips the scales? Maybe there's not. And what has your writing life taught you about navigating freedom through constraint?
Oh gosh, can y'all hear me? It's okay, it's good? Okay, great. Okay, nodding mass of surgical masks. I love it. I see you beyond that. Yeah, I think that the amassing my piles is kind of like an in-joke with myself, and then it has a kind of like scatological feeling of I do think of it kind of almost sculpturally, like there's a point at which, like, as you say, like it tips, like you just start collecting like thoughts and ideas, and then at a certain point, usually for me, I think of it very like I take it in and I research and think, and then there'll be like a tipping point at which my brain makes a sentence, and like this particular sentence was, I had wanted to write a book about freedom because I liked the weirdness of, it's like in the past tense, so it's kind of like, have I written it or haven't I written it yet? Did I give it up or did I keep with it? So like I'll kind of think a sentence, and then that will generally be the indication to me that it's time for me to write myself and not just keep taking in material, you know? But I think that, I mean, I was saying before too, when I was visiting your guys' class, that, you know, if you're lucky enough to get to write multiple books, like, you know, you don't always have to like look for ideas, because every project creates so much, like the piles of mass, and there's so much detritus that I think this book really came out of both the Argonauts and like the Argonauts. I'd read a lot about care in theory, but the book didn't end up really engaging that discourse head on. But and then in the Art of Cruelty, I'd been really interested in, like in this idea of concepts that had, how do I say it? It's like a kind of near and far cousins. It's like a kind of a Buddhist way of thinking about things, like where there's the thing that seems to be its opposite, and then there's the thing that like there's also that's like its far cousin, and there's like its near cousin. And I began to kind of realize in writing about brutality so much that it maybe wasn't like kindness or care that was maybe the opposite so much of a certain kind of violence or brutality, but it was maybe along the lines of the introduction that was given about story. It was actually more, I began to think it was more like when possibilities are shut down, when I mean, Foucault has spatializes it, as does Arendt, of like degrees of domination, and when like there's as Foucault has it, like there's more of them there are, like there's more space for freedom when there are fewer, there's fewer domination. As the amount of power grows, the space to practice freedom becomes less and less. It doesn't go to zero unless you have like a total domination instance, which I thought about actually a lot before in writing about my aunt, and I'd spent kind of years thinking about like homicide and as a kind of ultimate end of the story, or end of space to move. Now you've been rendered, not a subject. So I think I just had a lot of thoughts about that, and then that coincided with the fact that in the art stuff, I just had been getting, that there was this kind of, I'm very alert to like dichotomies that get set up, not because I think that there's anything like people sometimes I think there's something wrong with binaristic thinking, like as if the binary is the enemy, and it's like, I don't quite think of it like that. I think of it more like what we set up as the binary has information in it, and if we don't like that binary, if it's not working, then we have to be like, what does this binary, like what's it allowing us to see, because that's the point of making a distinction or an opposition, and then what is it occluding? So I noticed in the art world there was a lot of opposition of like freedom of expression against this notion of care or obligation to others, and it was kind of coming in like every single invitation I got was about like aesthetics of care, or maybe it's time to stop talking about artistic freedom and now we should talk about care. And I was like, oh wow, this is really I was like, okay, here's the care freedom thing. And so I really focused on that there. And then, there's a different focus like that in every chapter. But I think I just started, as I just described, I started tracing how the word was moving, not to be like, what is artistic freedom? Like that would be the not the use question. My question was, what are we constructing by opposing these things? And then part of the pain of my book was that, like when the pandemic hit, the book was really all done. I was doing some of the final editing rounds, but like the pandemic, then brought that care freedom binary into like such technicolor. And I'd already spent like the last 5 years seeing like why it didn't go well to do that. And then I was like, oh no, like we're gonna do it like all the way to the ground, And I think that made me really sad. But yeah, I don't know. So this book, I just had a lot to say. I think I had a lot to say about all four of these areas and had been kind of saving it up. Like I'm sorry, I'm just babbling. I'm going to stop in 1 second. But I taught a class called Literature and Addiction for many years, just as a kind of pet interest of mine about like drug literature and drug memoir. And it began to kind of dawn on me that my interest there was like why why do so many people associate drug use and memoirs of drug use and drugs themselves with freedom or feelings of liberation or at least transgression, when in fact the actual books, when you read them and teach them or live it, are so often like the language is actually of servitude, of subjection, of like in the Henri Michaud book, it's about, he calls mescaline date rape. I mean, like there's so many different, and I thought that's so interesting. Like, why can't, like, what are we, like, what is this, what's going on? So I just kind of had like a burning question in every realm and had a lot to say, so.
I feel like there's a follow-up question there that has to do with that sense of like, aesthetics and care, and there's a certain, like, I think electricity that happens right now when we talk about care in the realm of aesthetics, and at the same time I think there's like a lot of thought ruts that have already developed around that topic. Like there's a way that you're supposed to think, and there's a little bit, and I feel this in my classrooms, like there's a performance of this conversation and everyone's doing a little bit of like policing each other to see if they're performing it right.
Yep.
And at the same time, there's like a transgressive energy to it. And I'm curious, you write in this book about sort of cops in the head. And I'm curious, as you're writing about care and aesthetics, do you notice yourself getting, how do you see the thought ruts? How do you like notice the cops in your head and get out of the cops in your head? Is it, do you triangulate? Like what happens? Because I think that that's a place that certainly in the classroom, I feel like we get stuck sometimes, especially as care becomes this more all-encompassing way that we approach literature.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this real difficulty about the fact that, like, there's a Sontag quote, I'm trying to remember what it is, but I'm not, I might have put it in my book description. Let me see. No, I didn't. Not as plagiarism, like I might have said something about, but like, the quote has something to do with like, the job of a writer, of a critic, not necessarily a writer, but of a critic being to kind of like, I'm totally paraphrasing, I'm getting it wrong, but kind of like sniffing out like a piety at like its first beginning to be, like encrusted, like what, like, and to, not let that happen. But then of course there's like there's like a danger of like, there's being a reactionary, where you're just like, oh, because I sense the word care becoming, a stale piety that people are performing and not actually performing in life. They're just performing it as like a police function. I don't think that you're caring enough, or it's not caring, or you're not, whatever. Or we were talking before about like, how academics are so good at being like, that's individualistic logic, that's neoliberal logic. And you're like, that's cool. Like, like we need to embody and practice and learn other things instead of just, point out when we sniff out the thing. So, but then there's that reactionary thing where then if all you're doing is like being frustrated with the piety, then you're not like, then you can just like become a crank, and that's not, or worse, I mean, right now, like, or worse. I'm just gonna keep saying or worse because there's just this kind of like, don't even get me started. Red pill curious kind of like, free thinking, what I'm talking about thing, like that's not, and it was really hard to write this book to be like, to want to point out, especially with care, because part of the difficult, like feminists have been working on this concept for many, many decades and saying like, it's not just, you can't just revalorize care without looking at its racialized and sexualized, like engendered history. Like you can't just do that, because if we just do that, like we'll just be resaddling the same people who are already doing the care work, and like this is not, and also you have to recognize that care and coercion, as I say in the book, like exist in and not. Like there are many people doing a lot of care work who perhaps don't wish that they were doing all that care work, or that need it socialized. I don't mean necessarily like in a government program, but they need it distributed, So you can't just valorize it. It doesn't. It's like not. But there's this line, because, and I knew the book rode this line, and I knew that like the not careful or not generous or not just with me reader maybe would, not always stick with me, and that like they might feel like that critical attention, like it would be too scary to put that critical attention on a word that you want to hold all the ethical, goodness or valor of the moment. And I know that, but because I really do, but because I have this fidelity to like the Sontagian principle, I feel like that, it's both my job to do it with the piety, but it's also my job to analyze myself a lot to make sure that I understand where my own irritations or frustrations or just ideologies are coming from. Because when you don't do that self-reflexive labor, it's all just going to be essentially, your demographic autobiography. Like, I just seem to think this way. Who knows why? It couldn't have anything to do with my whiteness or my privilege or whatever, and so that's not good enough either. So the book was very much like these two dual processes kept being underway,
Your introduction concludes with this discussion of knots, and I've read that an earlier title for this book was Freedom Knots.
That's true.
I'm really curious about that movement between...
But it's weird because then it's like a what do you call it, a homophone? Like Freedom Knots.
Right.
I couldn't do it, Yeah.
I'm curious about that movement from knots to songs. I love that songs, and I was wondering if you could talk about the process there.
That's funny. I read this book, some of you probably know it, this Artie Lang book, Knots, years ago, and it just blew my friggin' mind. Like, it's funny, my partner Harry and I talk about knots like every other day. I really recommend it, Artie Lang, Knots. Like, you heard it here first. But in the book, he's sketching his patients. So he was like big in the anti-psychiatry, movement or whatever you want to call it, and he's sketching his patients' mental knots. Like, I want to suck this finger. No, the finger is ugly. Take it away. I took away the finger. Where's the finger? I'm abandoned. Bring back the finger. I'm suffocated. Like, he's just sketching them out on paper, like what the patients would tell themselves within their kind of various mental afflictions. And I think part of why it was so moving to me was that because I'm by nature a kind of mapper and like parser, not a like inspiring, demagogue or whatever. Like, I'm not a here's what we should do. I'm really attracted to just kind of seeing if my role in getting as much clarity of like the map, like just seeing what then, once we see this and then I don't know, like it may or may not be good enough, but also the knots, what Artie Lang is doing is that what's so brilliant is they're not just maps of these patients. They're poems, and so they do something else too. They do something else, and I think that's what like literature can do is like, okay, yeah, you're just mapping it or whatever, but if you do it right, you're creating a kind of affective field that does more than the sum of the parts. So I started with this knot thing where I was just mapping, and I was mapping these freedom, unfreedom things because how do I say it? Like one of the first things I did with this book was I went online and just there are these websites that have like freedom slogans. They're really scary because they're like, it could bring you a lot of directions. If you want to be like, radicalized by the algorithm quickly, I don't recommend this experience, but I noticed that, I wrote down jillions of them, right wing, left wing, abolitionist, whatever, but I noticed that a lot of them had a lot of them again had a kind of spatial element, like no one, the man who's holding the, chain is not free, if the man's attached to their side of the chain, like they all had these kind of propositions about interrelation. They were all like, don't tread on me. It's like, there's a me and there's an imperative to a you, and like they were all in relation, even as they, and I talk about this later in the sex chapter about a protest of like coming upon a bunch of, it was a slut walk where a bunch of different people were holding up a sign that says, your body has nothing to do with my body. And I kind of talk about, I get it as a slogan, but how, the fact that like 10 people were holding up this sign was like a visual demonstration of how their bodies had everything to do with each other's bodies, because otherwise you can't hold up the sign. And I just got really like, what are these proclamations of autonomy that require us to say them communally? I know, really interested in all that. Okay, so I started mapping out those kinds of knots, like from these slogans, trying to just see how they worked, like seeing, because part of this book's, as I say in the part I didn't read to you, was like this book begins with the idea that there's only a we, like there's only the communal, like freedom. I don't believe in the individualistic one. However, that doesn't mean that there's not a dance, as we were talking about before, between, we all are like imprisoned in, ego, like we all, so there's always a dance between self and other. It's not like you obliterate the self when you begin to navigate being in communion. I mean, you may in like nirvana, but most of life is spent in a negotiation. So all of which is to say that I worked with that for a while, couldn't stick with the title. But then the songs just, again, like I'm kind of joking with myself. I don't think anyone else thinks this is funny. I really don't. And I know they don't, because I read a lot of reviews that didn't think that this was funny, because they were like, why would Maggie Nelson write a book in such a turgid idiom and call it songs? Like, she knows how to write a song, so. And I was like, that's the whole thing. Like that's the whole thing. Is like, can this kind of thinking also be a song? Like, can we be in a kind of abstract philosophizing, like poetic space that brings in all these voices, and that sometimes sounds academic and sometimes sounds really direct, but we conceive of it still as like a kind of polyvocal song that like I'm singing, but I'm singing with others' help and people are hearing. Like that was the kind of, but I knew that, but the joke of it was that like, yes, I know it doesn't, like I know it's not a song, like, like I know it's not like a great ditty, you know what I mean? But I think I really liked also, like for me, I always try and pick a subtitle that has a form content proposition in it. And I think for me, the proposition was also, like symphonic sounds too aggrandizing, but it was like, can these kind of loose and baggy monsters of chapters, can they like have different moods? Can they ebb and flow? Can they do a call and response? Can they do a theme and variation? Like that was how I was formally constructing them. So I wanted to like find a subtitle that somehow paid homage to that. You know?
That makes me think, I feel like we've spoken about sex briefly, art aesthetics briefly. Mm-hmm. And part of what you're talking, so I want to put on I'm an environmental writer, if you have to like put me in a bucket. And so I want to put on like the climate hat for a second and say, this book has this whole section on climate. And I have to say, when I was like, oh my God, Maggie Nelson's writing about climate, this is awesome.
And then
no, it's like that's just like, it's an exciting proposition to me. And I think what I want to know is more, I sometimes feel like as a person who's inside this conversation so deeply that I can't even see the contours of it anymore. And so I also have no idea sometimes how to think about talking to someone who doesn't think about it. Like a friend of mine recently was like, why don't you go ask our mutual friend if he knows what the word Anthropocene is? And I was like, oh, he obviously knows. Right, and then I went and asked, and he was like, I don't know what that is. I was like, whoa.
A mutual friend who works on climate, or someone who doesn't work on climate.
And I was like, oh, okay, that word that I take of is like, everyone in the world knows this word. It turns out that's not true. Yeah. And that was really, an enlightening moment for me. Yeah. And so I'm curious what it was like to step into the conversation and what opportunities did it present? What challenges did it present?
Oh my God. I mean, that chapter was probably, for being someone who's not like an environmental writer or like in all that, it probably took the very longest to research. I think just because I was, art, sex, and drugs, for better or for worse, been there. But yeah, like the climate one, I really felt like before I could say anything, I had so much to read, and I had so much to read, and it. I read a lot, and I think there are different people have different approaches to their anxiety, as I'm sure you all will not be a newsflash, and my approach is very kind of. Definitely at times to a fault, like to overexpose to the bad thing, like I like to read everything, look at everything, kind of can't stop, which is very opposite for, people who have an avoidance strategy. I mean, neither one I don't think is better or worse. I think people who do the overexposure think that what they're doing is better, but I'm not really convinced. But I think, so it took a long time to read and then to decide what to write. And then I also kind of, I knew I wasn't entering the conversation. I mean, I have some good friends who are climate activists, and that was kind of helpful. And they read the chapter at different points, and that was also useful because, I mean, they were just, I don't know if you feel like this or if people that in the field feel like this, but they too felt like even if I made egregious errors or missteps or they didn't agree with certain things, they did feel such gratitude that I was like taking it on and that I was going to do it and that like I had a readership and that it was worthwhile, that they were like, no, just like, keep going, keep going, or they'd point out things for me to read. I think I didn't, it was really clear to me that the chapter was not top 10 things you can do to decarbonize your life. The chapter was not like, are we or are we not headed towards the brick wall? Like, there was none of those things. What I decided to do in that chapter was, that chapter, I would say more than any of them. I mean, they actually all are structured a little bit like, I hate to say it, but I only noticed in retrospect, they all have a little bit of like a sermonistic structure in the style of like Emerson's Nature or something, whereby they begin with the problem, where do we find ourselves on a stair? Where do we find ourselves in a crisis of freedom? Where do we find ourselves, like in the sex chapter, I kind of begin with this like story that we're told that like sexual liberation failed and that things are worse now than they were. And again, the question is like, why this story? What is this story doing? Like why? It's not empirically true. So why this story? Like what frustrations or rages does it express? So in the climate chapter, I really knew that my in was kind of twofold. One, it was linking it to this conversation about freedom, because again, the climate chapter is so, the climate in general is so often framed as like, well, if we want to do anything about this, you're just going to have to accept limits on your freedom. And I was kind of like, yeah, okay, but that's like not, I don't mean this like, we need a different message because that's not winning. Like, it's not like that. But I actually just was more curious, like, there's so many unfreedoms that the climate crisis makes us all feel. I mean, namely that I think probably everybody in this room would prefer to have their daily lives not imbricated in the climate crisis, for one, and don't feel like you have the choice. Like, I took a jet plane to get here, I'm talking to you while drinking a petroleum-based water. Like, I don't want any of this shit. Like, I really don't, but I'm doing it, right? And you all are too. So that first kind of foundational level is like, can we shift this conversation about freedom? Like, and can we also get used to this idea of restraint as a choice? That like you don't have to get all the remaining fossil fuels out of the ground, and that restraining yourself from doing that is a choice that you could make, looking at the available options and being like, which one would we like? So I was really interested in, so there are two parts to that chapter. One was the tether to the freedom conversation, and then the second was just the way I'd done in other of my writings, like performatively using myself as the kind of like dummy everyman who is bumbling into the climate darkness. And like we were talking about before, this Timothy Morton book, Dark Ecology, where it's structured by like, first we'll enter like, it's all these, he calls them the darknesses, and there's like the sweet dark and the uncanny dark, and like these different phases that you go through in immersing in climate literature and facts. I don't know, I'm very curious, Liz, to hear about your moving through the different darknesses. But I think the thing about Dark Ecology that when I read it really resonated with me was that you if you kind of took the ride, like you actually could come out in a different spot, and that the spot you came out on might make you feel more empowered and joyful and dedicated. And I felt that happening the more I went through it. And I actually felt, it's funny, a friend of mine recently asked me, they were like, so are you saying that you felt like better about the climate crisis after you wrote that chapter? And I was like, oh, about the climate crisis? No. like not the facts? No. I was like, but I felt like in a much better place to just live my days and try and be of service, like in a way that the bad place was like, kind of like, again, with like the degrees of domination, like the bad place was the box. So I think I was trying to I thought, well, I could use myself as the kind of dummy who moves from, like the chapter begins at a place I used to take my son a lot when he was a kid called Travel Town, which is like a place in LA where old steam trains have gone to rest. So it's like a steam train museum. And, he loved it, totally ecstatic, couldn't get enough of it, just desperate for a travel town. And then I think it's in Hyper Objects, I can't remember, some Morton book, there's and in many books talking about, the kind of golden spike, like looking for the beginning of the Anthropocene. There's there's different theories and different hypotheses and angles and pitches, but, one that often is, a lot of people mark the steam engine and the patenting, Watt's patenting of the steam engine, and I can't remember the year, 84 or something, as one potential golden spike. In addition to, because of the energy the steam engine used, it also began extractive, procedures on a very large scale that enabled so many things from, its role in slavery, its role in a million things. So I think, the beginning of that chapter has me kind of in bliss with my son at Travel Town, and I'm describing everything we're doing there and all the trains, and then I say, it's funny because in this Morton book I'm reading, like, he has a refrain where he says, the end of the world has already occurred. We can date the day the world ended. It was on, March 7th, 1784, when James Watt patented the steam engine. And I keep going to Travel Town, and like every time I'm there, I keep thinking the end of the world has already occurred. It happened on, and I'm just like looking at the trains, and it's just, so that's what I kind of mean about using myself as a dummy, like just being like, how do I contend with the feeling of being at the start of something with all the messaging being that it's already ended, because that's not really particular to climate. It's all of our predicament being mortal, but the climate crisis makes it, like it scales it up in a way that I think makes it feel intolerable, because it's not just our mortality or the ones we love, but it begins to be, species, not just human species, but thousands of other species. And I think it's very understandable to me, as I say in the chapter, that people don't want to live in that kind of grief every day. I don't think it is like functional, but I do think we feel it even if we're not looking at it. And I think, at least for me, it felt like more harm or less good would come of not, instead of just letting it like low-grade fester the way that it probably does in all of us. So anyway, long answer, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We wanted to end with maybe...
Ending, oh my God, okay, great, yeah.
Maybe a question with a little joy in it.
Oh, great. Well, that was joyful, was it not? It was kind of joyful. The chapter.
The chapter, yeah,
it ends
has
joyfully.
Moments. So what does reading pleasure look like in your house?
Oh my God.
What's on your nightstand?
Oh God. Oh God. Oh my God. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Someone asked, I wish I could see all your faces. I could remember if the person from class, was it you? Yes, asked about reading, right? Yes, right, yes. Look, I didn't even have to look at, excellent. We talked about this earlier in class. Like, yeah, they were asking about the question had to do with what do I read? And I was like, I feel like I don't read. I feel like a lot of shame because but I think it's just like I read, I don't really read for pleasure. I read carnivorously. I read the things I have to. I read the things I assign. I read the things I'm obligated to read. I read my friends' work. I read, and then occasionally a book will drop by the radar that I'm not having any relationship to, and I'll pick it up. And sometimes it's, great, but I don't have, and reading is like, who was it? Maybe another friend today talking, saying like, will people even be reading in 5 years? Like, I too have experienced, especially during the pandemic, a lot of degradation of reading powers. But on the other hand, the last couple of months have been a great reading time for me. I'm trying to think of what I've read. I feel like I've just read so many books in quick succession, probably mostly contemporary. Nothing coming to mind. I'll try and think, but like I'm. Yeah, I don't know. I'll think. Like the whole desk side of that's why I was like hitting my head against the microphone, because my next to my bed dresser is not where there are books or anything. So I was like, "What's on your desk?" And I'm always like, "Nothing." But yeah, I mean, I think it's. Let me try to think of one book I've read recently.
Like that's our takeaway. Maggie Nelson's got nothing.
She doesn't
on her
read
case.
anything. I know nothing on my bedside stand. No, I have two things there. One is a weapon. It's a sculpture made by my partner, and one is a box of silver dollars from my deceased father. That's all that's on my bed. And now that's the most intimate thing I've ever told anybody, including in all of my literature. So let's end before I say anything more.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I think we'll walk you through the back or whatever. Do you want to?
Maggie Nelson will be signing books in the lobby. So if you'd like to do that, go to the lobby.